Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sego, and welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. I'm your host. And, look, we've got a guest with us today, and we're going to actually do another one of our kind of two-part series here. And today I have the director of a short documentary called The Bears on Pine Ridge, and we'll get into explaining if you're not familiar with the film, we'll explain a little bit more of the film. So what we're going to do today is talk with Noel Bass, who is the director of The Bears on Pine Ridge. And then in the next episode, we will have two of the featured personalities from the film, Tiny Decory and Eileen Janis, who are featured, are the main features of the film. So let me first go ahead and introduce Noel Bass. Noel, thank you for joining me on Let's Talk Native.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity not only to do this one show, but to do two, covering the topic and allowing your platform for us to do it. It's not often that a topic like this gets exposure, so I'm very grateful.
Well, and there's so much in Native territory to talk about. I mean, there's we lead in so many of the top of the list on so many lists you don't want to be at the top of, and among them are things like suicide and depression and substance abuse and missing and murdered Indigenous women, all of these things that plague our territories. And this film that you are such a big part of here is about those first two topics. This topic of suicide prevention, but suicide and depression. Talk to me a little bit about your background and how you came to be involved with the folks in Pine Ridge.
Sure. My story isn't an amazing story, so I'll keep it really short. I was born in Southern California. My dad is Latino from Mexico. We do have some indigenous roots, but not in what you would consider the United States of America. It's more into Mexico. And growing up in Southern California, there isn't a huge Native American presence. I'd say like a large reservation or whatnot, but there are casinos and that are actually doing pretty well. And my professional background is photography, so I did that for 15 years in Los Angeles. And at that point, I was dealing with some personal struggles, some depression that I was going through. I wasn't very satisfied with what I was doing with my life. And, just in general, depression can hit from multiple factors or a multitude of situations. For whatever reason, it was very crippling. And so I wanted to research it, and I started picking up psychology books and talking to friends who knew a bit about it. And this is where the introduction to me of Native American and indigenous suicide situation was happening right here in this country, and it blew my mind. And so at that point, I started researching more. Going on YouTube, and YouTube was still not new, but it wasn't what it is today. So I was actually going to the library, looking for books, ordering books online, and all the while learning about the Lakota culture. I learned about the suicide state of emergency that they had. And so I took my first trip out there in 2011, and you know, uh, I don't know if you've ever spent time on Pine Ridge, but there's not really, a lot of places set up for tourists. There's not a lot of hotels or things of that nature. And I think they have one casino hotel that's kind of out, like about 30 miles out of town. And so I volunteered for a family, and through doing that, I was able to drive around and ask questions and meet people, and that's where I met Tiny and Eileen. And ever since then, I've been connected to them um, and the cause. And so, yeah, that's my background.
Well, and let me back up a little bit because one of
Sure.
the things and I'm native. I'm Mohawk or Gunyagahaga, which
Hmm.
is Haudenosaunee. We're out on the east side of Turtle Island, as we say. Um,
Yeah.
and one of the things that I can't like overlook is some of what many people who do identify as Latino, there must be a certain amount of struggle because of that indigeneity and some of the erasure that goes with some of that indigenous culture. And
Hmm.
while I'm certainly not trying to psychoanalyze you by any means, I can't help but wonder, when I do see people, indigenous people, regardless of how much indigenous culture they are tied to, I
Hmm.
wonder because we have this thing about intergenerational trauma, and
Yeah.
so I think even for many people who may identify as Mexican or Latino or and have some vague um, connection to indigeneity. I wonder how much that still ends up being, not only an underlying um, conflict, I think for some people, but I wonder if that somehow, made this connection for you that much more important.
Yeah, that's a solid question and a solid point. I've always had, issues with identity when it comes to race in general, because, and I don't want to speak badly about America. Obviously, there's a lot to love about America, but America is something where one particular race does really well, and if you don't look like that race, then it's a struggle in a lot of aspects. But I didn't particularly. I've had very few situations where some racism was thrown at me, so I was very fortunate that way. Um, but our family home, I spoke Spanish to my dad and English to my mom. But going back to what you're saying with the root, I do believe there is something there. Definitely. I spent time in Mexico with my dad's side of the family, and there's so many similarities to the way the energy and the way they speak to each other that are similar to what I found in the Lakota culture. Um, yeah, I'll give you an example. In Pine Ridge, even though they are struggling with um, a lot of poverty and mental health issues and everything that you listed before, there's an amazing amount of warmth that I was familiar with already, coming from that Mexican side. You're laughing, they're telling jokes, they're picking each other up, and so I felt comfortable right away. And in fact, every time I go, um, I'll go and live there for about anywhere from a month to 3 months at a time. I have an RV now, so I can set the RV down in like a field of a family that I know, or in a backyard of a family that I know, or a nearby town. And every time I go, I feel this warmth come over. You're going to a place where people are trying to make each other laugh, and people are trying to, they're kind of, there's a sense of like, hey, we're all in this together, and there's something very special about Pine Ridge. And maybe that's because it is isolated, but I think it's also um, from just generations and generations and generations of a certain way of life and how they view, um, uh, the important things in community and in their family versus, I guess you could say, like a capitalist society. So yeah, it definitely. I think there is a connection there. I feel it. I don't know if I can, you know, pinpoint it to somewhere in my genetics. Obviously, I am a mixed bag. I have a lot of different um, ethnicities, but there's something very, very familiar, I think, to the Latino culture.
Well,
So
and you mentioned and this isn't unique to Pine Ridge, although Pine Ridge is oftentimes cited as probably the most dramatic example of of policy, not just induced, but to policy caused poverty inflicted upon a people. But
yeah,
you mentioned isolation, and I think the isolation isn't just geographical. I mean, it clearly it's an isolation of it's a social isolation as well. When you consider what the whole reservation system was about, it was about pushing a people, an entire race that varied even in amongst ourselves as Native people, an entire race of people onto very small parcels of land that would be taken out of the public consciousness of the dominant society around us. So that isolation is both geographical, but it's also a social isolation.
yeah, absolutely. And then also there's I mean, there's a lot of aspects, but you got to put in this aspect where at a certain point where they're being punished for living their Lakota ways, their spiritual ceremonies, and things like this, even speaking the language in boarding schools, when they're being punished for that, you would want to have some kind of isolation after that, wouldn't you?
Sure.
You'd want to, and I think that's the trauma that you're talking about. That's generational, and some say that even goes into their DNA, so that their offspring carry it.
Yeah, the epigenetics
Um,
argument. Sure, sure.
yeah, I mean, I totally believe that,
Yeah,
right?
oh
I
no,
mean,
I do too.
yeah,
Well, and
yeah,
on again on that isolation note, there's also this idea that Native people that we do struggle to maintain not just identity but distinction. And oftentimes, part of our effort to maintain that distinction is to create space between us and the
mhm,
dominant cultures around us. Again,
yeah,
socially, geographically, but all of that stuff. So, yeah, so the isolation we in many ways contribute to that because that's part of our resistance to the forces of assimilation that are all around us.
yeah, and especially when you look at Native culture and indigenous people been hurt so many times by the integration with. You can go back to the Spaniards, or and then the movement of the American government and the soldiers, and even today in media, what you have are news crews going in and not spending time with the community, telling a story that gets put on 5 p.m. news, and it continues. And so, those are some of the barriers that, um, are difficult in filming in it, or I should say initially, for a lot of filmmakers to understand going into a community like Pine Ridge is so unique and has so much history. You got to understand how much they've been through and how many people like you have gone there trying to capture a story with
Sure.
bad intent. And so,
If it bleeds, it
you
leads,
know,
right? I mean, and this is kind of the way,
yeah,
sensationalizing the trauma, and we've seen that with news crews over the years that almost make, there's that expression poverty porn that
yeah,
gets,
yeah,
and so there's that. But let's get, I mean, I want to get down to the film a little bit before we
sure.
use up too much more time. I mean, it's great
Yeah,
talking to you though, and I think this is all
yeah.
really valid conversation. But one of the things that before we even start, I got to say that up until a few years ago, the idea of actually quantifying or measuring childhood suicide, it was
Mhm,
such an anomaly that it wasn't even it wasn't even measurable. And I say that on behalf, as a part of American, the overall U.S. numbers. The idea of children committing suicide was so
mhm,
low, and
yeah,
and so when some of these youth suicides began really escalating on native territories and in Pine Ridge in particular, that's
mhm,
when it became so alarming because you're talking about a tragedy that was almost unmeasurable up until until it became almost of epidemic proportions.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I have talked to a lot of elders and a lot of people who are maybe not quite elders, in their 50s and 60s, or whatever you would consider an elder beyond that. But we, this is a topic that if you go to Pine Ridge, everybody has something to say about it. This isn't something that has not been talked about. Everybody wants it to get solved. And the difference is that in the past, I think in the 80s, they had a really bad problem, is where it started. And then I think another swell in the 90s. But really in the 2000s, that's when it sort of became a cluster situation where people started to look at it like an epidemic, because it was happening, sometimes 4 in a week, or 4 in a month, or Tiny, in one of her talks, she says that there were 66 attempts in 1 month. And that's a small community, that's not, excuse me, that's not, big city. These are people that everyone knows each other. And if they don't know each other, they know the brother of, or the cousin of, or the family of, or, that person's in my class or in my school. And so you're talking about 66 youth suicide attempts in 1 month for a community. Think about the fear. So this is, as much as, this is about suicide, this is a unique situation that does not apply to communities that are more privileged, who may have one suicide in their whole life, in their community, or maybe one in their school, maybe they know one family member down the line. This is it's almost like a presence that they're forced to then now talk about and figure out what to do, right? And it's hard to figure out what to do when a lot of your spiritual ways have been taken away, to where a lot of these kids don't have that founding, that grounding anymore. Eileen and Tiny will talk more about that. I don't want to speak too much about
Sure.
this. I'm just going to tell you about what I experienced in filming, and there is this narrative. It isn't something that is hush hush. Everybody wants to talk about it. Everybody has in their hearts, they want to help the children. But this is a new dialogue. This is, I'd say, within 40, 30 years, maybe even 20 years, where they're really accepting, okay, we need to really, really talk about this. And that's where the film comes in, and it talks about the state of emergencies. Because here's, you could start to say, the first attempt where a tribe is saying, we need national awareness. We need attention now. Your hospital systems that the government has set up here isn't doing its job. We don't have the funding to stop this. We need attention. We are traumatized. Suicide comes from all the historical traumas, the generational traumas, the modern day inadequate support from the government. It's all tied into suicide. And so the youth suicide, you could look at as kind of the worst effect, in your opinion, of all these traumas that are still not repaired, not talked about. There are no reparations. And, so what we're seeing here, this is directly related to the traumas, historical traumas, and the inadequacies of the government, for sure.
Well, and again, one of the things that I talk about on my program here is that even beyond the historical trauma is the real life um, circumstances that exist now, with the
Yeah.
lack of hope or the lack of prospects for the future, or the motivation for. I mean, look, we experience these mass exodus of people leaving our territories because there are not opportunities on our territory. So as a child, when you become aware that there's so very little in your community that is going to drive you, to motivate you to achieve something, that lack of hope and that lack of any prospect for your future, that gets coupled with that historical trauma.
Absolutely. And then let's say they do get a job and they feel good about themselves for a week, right? And then at the end of that week, let's say the boss yells at them or treats them in a way that they're not used to. Or let's say that they don't give them a break because it's like, hey, we have 80% unemployment here. You're just dispensable.
Mm.
And so, their one chance, or their first step into employment is probably not a positive one. But again, this all draws back to, this is the effects of colonization without the extra attention that needed to go on with an agreement between the United States government and the indigenous communities that they sign treaties with. If you sign a treaty saying we're going to take care of your health care, we're going to take care of your schooling, your food, your housing, medical, then that doesn't mean we're going to do that on paper and then walk away and you're going to get the substandard of everything. If you think about everything that the government does now for the country, let's say the roads or whatnot, right? So as things advance, the bridges become higher tech, the hospitals get higher tech, the schools get more, educational materials, computers, all these things. So the government knows that things advance and they put the extra money into things for the American people. And that's because the American people demand it and whatnot. That's not happening on reservations. If you make a contract or a peace treaty with a Native community, you say, you're going to get free health care. I'll just take that one example. Then as medical science becomes more technical, it progresses, it becomes, we're curing cancers and other things. The highest quality of every agreement should be upheld, of education, the highest housing, the highest standards of medical. But that's not what's happening on reservations. What's happening is that's not being upkept. They're looking at a treaty as something that's history.
Right.
But a treaty should be something that is a contract that every year should be looked at and graded and taken into account. And the problem is, the reason it's not is because most Americans, about 80% of Americans, don't even know a lot about what's happening on reservations.
Yeah, I heard one poll that said 40% of Americans don't even know Native people still exist.
There's a great survey done by illuminatives.org. Illuminatives.org. Your listeners can go to that. They've spent 2 years and I think $3 million or something to research what Americans know about Native Americans, and it showed pretty much nothing. Most of them don't know that they exist, which is just absolutely unexplainable, and that can't happen. Not anymore.
Well,
it should be 100%. Yeah.
In the film, you had you have a clip with Simon. What's his name?
Moya Smith.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you had an interview with Simon Moya Smith.
Yeah,
and he specifically talked about the intent of the reservation system was essentially was really geared towards eliminating us. Let us go there to die. And I would argue that much of the policy that was intended on creating an uncomfortable life for Native people was twofold. One is, yes, we would just fade away or die there, or we would leave those territories and then just become, assimilated into the bottom-most rungs of American society. And in fact, there was a policy in the 70s that was called the relocation program, which took Native people off territories, gave them some menial job in an urban environment, and maybe some crappy apartment to live in, and sometimes hundreds of miles away from the Native territory. And that cut the ties. So, and I bring that up because as we confront the problems today, and the problem specifically that your film is confronting, which is the suicide problem, especially the youth suicide problem, it can't just be looked at as an oversight, and from a Native standpoint, I know I view many of these things as more than just incompetence or an oversight, but almost in a way, a bit of an assault. So let's talk about how you got started with actually doing the film, who contributed to forming the idea of doing this film.
Sure. So it took a while. Like I said, my first trip was in 2011. I met Tiny and Eileen, who your listeners are going to have the privilege to hopefully see in the film, and then also hear on your podcast. Amazing women in general. Besides the point of what they're doing and what they do out of their life too, they're just incredible individuals. have raised incredible families, very solid support system, very spiritual minded with the Lakota way of life, educators, teachers. They have the only space on the reservation for donated goods. So they use some of they've been publicized in articles and some news, and a lot of people know about them around the world. So they get these donations, and they're able to get, clothing for children, school materials, and hygienic needs, just everything you could think of. In the winter, they get a lot of boots and jackets. They're so busy. They even go to court to defend certain kids. I mean, they have their hands in everything to try and help that community. And so when you get to talk to them, know that you're talking to two heroes of mine, like true heroes that I haven't seen anyone on any caliber like this anywhere in my life. So so in 2012, I did a little bit of filming, but I was mostly a photographer. I was more just learning about the community, learning about things. There's a lot of issues on Pine Ridge. There's a town called White Clay, a liquor that sells liquor. It's all owned by white people who do not give back to the community. They're just there to sell booze to the dry reservation. So that was a big thing. So there was a lot to learn. You learn about the history. You learn about the horse riding culture, the Buffalo Society. There's just it was fascinating to me, and so I kept going back before I eventually finally left LA. In 2015, I decided to take a friend of mine to actually do it for real. And by that time, Tiny and I had gained enough of a relationship where obviously she trusted me and knew that I cared about the issue. And then from there, I got to meet the youth, bear kids that are going to be in the film. And then I don't know how much time we have here, so I'll just tell the listeners, one of the great parts about the film is the film dives into Tiny and Eileen's Bear Program project, which is a collective of suicide survivors that some of them they've saved themselves. And these teenagers, were at their lowest. They've struggled, with life on the reservation, poverty, sometimes sexual abuse, problems with education, all the problems that you'll see on the reservation. And Tiny takes them in, and Tiny and Eileen take them in and give them kind of a safe space and what you call a bear cave. They have this space where they could play games and hang out. And they created this program where they go out in mascot outfits, big animal, bright, big, colorful, furry mascot outfits, where they get to cover themselves and become this character. And you find a lot of them start to put on this ego that they would have. They had this confidence, and so they'll walk up in these costumes and they'll flirt with people in the audience. They'll make people laugh. They become really this inspirational group of performers.
So
You'll see a bit of it.
essentially, they adopt an alter ego. So as reserved or uh, as self or introverted as they may be, once they put these
Yes,
costumes on, they become another ego that allows them to be much more engaging, not only to adults but to
absolutely.
other children in particular.
And not only that, you'll find that everyone that's in the Bears, and I want to say most people who are depressed to where they want to commit suicide, most of them, from what I found, are really passive, sweet people. They don't like confrontation. They don't like, to fight. And so they take things harder. So this program in a costume offers them a chance to go and hug kids. They're getting hugs, and they're going up to kids and hugging them, and they're all dancing together. They're doing the things they wish they could do in real life. But after that, um, this is a way to get them to build their courage and excitement through the program. But what Tiny does is when she knows that a kid is ready at a certain point to speak, to take off the outfit and speak, she'll give them the microphone and let them say whatever they want to say. And so these kids, and the reason for that is by these kids talking about their struggles and their depression, it could be abuse, bullying, whatever it is. by doing that, she knows that someone in the audience who isn't talking about it is going to hear it, and they're going to identify, and they're going to say, I want to speak up too, because she's found that the ones that actually do commit slipped through their fingers. They didn't know. They were the quiet ones. And so, what Tiny is doing is something that you really can't, it's not something that you can be taught through, literature about suicide, or, you take a PhD that wants to talk about certain psychological tendencies or mental illness, where people fit mental illness or medications. She's doing it for her community, and she's figured out that most of this is because people have no one to talk to, or they think they're alone. And so she's giving an empowered place for these youth. It's just really special. I'm talking a lot here, but it's a really, and I say Tiny, but Eileen is part of this too, and you'll get to talk to Eileen.
Now,
Yeah.
and so the film, really, although it gets its title from the this Bears program, or this almost mascot program. I hate to use the word mascot because that's like a bad
It
word
can
for
be looked at.
native territories,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But these are not native mascots. These are all huggable,
Characters. Yeah,
animal characters.
yeah,
And so, so it gets its name from that. But really, the film delves into the suicide problem in general. And
yeah.
so much of, and look, it even gets into some of the the family struggles. Even I know the part with Eileen's daughter expressing her concern for how much her mother gives into this thing, and the toll it takes
Oh
on her.
yeah,
So it's all of
yeah,
that. So I mean, the film is pretty powerful. Now it's a short document. This is a 40-minute documentary,
yeah,
right? Why
yeah.
why is it? Did you choose to do the short? Is there an intent to do a full length feature at some point?
There is, as you know about the industry and stuff. It takes a lot of effort to make a movie. It's not just one person telling its story. There's a lot of different positions to fill, and those all take time and money. And so there just wasn't simply, there was not enough time or money to wait longer to make a feature, because it's going to take a lot longer.
Sure.
And the other thing too is, we, in filming, it was all out of pocket, because we're covering a community that is maybe had a bad relationship with media, and it's not going to understand a crowdfund for going to filmmakers, right?
Right.
Even if your intent is solid. So everything was out of pocket, and that's why it took such a long time. Until recently, we did one crowdfund just because we had a composer that just wouldn't do it for free. And he's a nice guy. I don't want to say that he wouldn't do it for free. He's working. He's a solid composer. But everyone else on this project volunteered their time
Sure.
and their resources.
Right.
But yeah, the feature is going to come out, and we're working on that now. And it's, again, all volunteer based. And
Well, tell me, how
yeah.
can somebody watch the film that you have? Again, the Bears on Pine Ridge. What is the best way
Yeah.
for listeners of this podcast to search out the film and to get a chance to see it?
Yeah. You're in New York. Is that right?
Yes.
We're going to be in a festival on the 30th or the 31st. It begins, called the New York International Film Festival. So I wanted to point people that way. You can support a festival, and all these festivals that are taking the film on, you have to support them, because they're taking on not only a short film that's probably way too long at 40 minutes, but a material that's very important, that we need a national, if not a world, discussion on the topic. So that's the new NYCIFF. It's New York City International Film Festival. But there is, for those who want to watch the film for free, it's currently playing at the Sarasota Native American Film Festival for a limited time. And you can go on and find the Bears in Pine Ridge on that for free. So I encourage any student, anyone that is low on funds, doesn't have the money to support a film festival, to please go and watch it there for free. So,
Now, are
and
some
by
of
the
these
way,
film
yeah,
festivals, like the one in New York City, is it virtual or is it in person?
yeah, they're all going to be virtual, and if they're doing in-person stuff, it'll be tied with virtual as well.
What's the date for the New York
Yeah,
City Film Festival?
that is, I believe, the 31st through the 14th.
Okay, so they may be able to gain some access to at least information on the film by going to that New York City Film International Film Festival.
That's right. And then, if you have listeners in Canada, there is a film festival there. I'd really love people to support called Pendants Film Festival. Very special, very, very special festival. They're putting this film as the opener. So imagine what that's going to do
Awesome.
for the issue and topic.
And then where's that
And
film
you
festival
can,
based out of?
Ontario
Okay, Toronto
in
specifically,
Canada.
or
Yeah, I think they're out of
okay, okay,
Toronto, but
okay, okay.
all of Ontario can screen it. Um, and I want to thank you. I know you have limited time here, but I want to thank you too. Like anyone that's giving this topic a platform, you're going to, obviously hear more about the situation from Tiny and Eileen. But that is what we're trying to do as a collaboration. We're not just filmmakers. I'm not, someone that's going to go and run and make a movie about, I don't know, love story or this or that. I'm really tied to this community and to this issue. And so what we're trying to do is, be a source to try and help to bring a national discussion, because there are, I can't even put a number on the amount of tribes that are going through the same situation and that are underrepresented. Their state of emergencies are not reaching the national level. And this is for reasons of, you could say isolation, but it's also because there is no pressure from, let's say, off-reservation Americans,
Sure.
because they're just not enlightened, right? So once people get enlightened, and then we can go to your politicians, your local politicians, your state politicians, and your federal government, and apply a lot of pressure and say, what
Well,
the
and
heck's going on here?
in this current climate of a national call for social justice, it's important that this issue be a part of that discussion. So, Noel Bass, I want to thank you
Yeah.
for joining me and giving some great insight. I know we talked about a lot of things beyond the film, and but I thank you for doing this work and introducing many people who may not know who Tiny Decore and Eileen Janis are. They'll be joining me on the next program. But I want to thank you so much for giving your background and what drew you to this issue. I appreciate the work that you've done.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I want to thank you guys for listening. This is Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane. And again, I give my thanks to Noel Bass for giving us so much of his time. Do check out part 2 of this series, and we will feature 2 of the main principles of on this film, Tiny Decore and Eileen Janis. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
Think about me one more time before you go. Someday you'll know. Someday you'll know. You already know what I'm going to say. I've been feeling this way for far too long.